You have to do art because you want to do it, and not because you think it will make you a living sometime. You've got to be directly involved with it. I had been reading Zane Grey and some of those stories, the Riders of the Purple Sage and so on, and nothing would do but that I be a cowboy. I took a year out of school and worked on a ranch. I loved the horses and the riding, and we went out on the chuck wagon. It was just the tail end of the old days, you know. And I got the job of being the vaquero, taking care of the horses. We had about 120 horses. Each man had a string of eight or 10 horses, and so I had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'd slip a bridle on my cow pony, whose name was Cowboy, and I would go out looking for the horses. And of course I hadn't the slightest idea of where they would be, especially for a while, till I began to know the country a little and understand the horses. So I just let my pony go, and she'd find the horses. And then during the day I'd take this big bunch of horses out and just keep an eye on them all day as they grazed, and try not to lose them. I was sketching and drawing and whittling a little bit. I always had that interest, and I really developed that interest when I was just a kid, 9 years old. I had an illness, and they'd given me a package of chewing gum as I was starting to get better, and I remember I chewed up the whole pack of gum and made my dog out of it. And so then my folks got me some plastiline, and I made all kinds of animals and this and that. But I somehow grew up not realizing that what art was, that it was something you could do in your life, you know. I was in my last year at UC Berkeley, and I became acquainted with a young fellow who used to come in occasionally and audit a course. We became friends just by chance, and he was he was a couple of years younger than I was, but he was much more mature. He was a painter. He wasn't going to be a painter. He was a painter already at that age, and his life was dedicated to that. And his name was David Park, and David got me interested in art. I went with him one day to San Francisco and visited some artist friends of his there. And one of the places we went was the studio of Ralph Stackpole, the San Francisco sculptor who was just getting started on a large commission for the San Francisco Stock Exchange. And I remember we stepped through this little gate in the fence across the front of the lot where his studio was, between two big brick buildings, and stepping into that yard of his. And here were all these stones and a big derrick, and I was overwhelmed, and I knew this was it. I went back and talked to Stackpole several times and ended up getting a job. There were two great stone pylons, I think 18 feet high, something like that. They were a family group figure, sort of. Simplified, sort of in the manner of Bordel. I worked almost 3 years there and ended up doing a lot of stone cutting on the building and learned to sharpen and temper tools and just everything about sculpture. And that was my training, and that's what I've done ever since. It was a long time before I could earn a living, and I had to supplement my living by doing other things. I worked as my first job was as a laborer for M.J. Murphy. And I remember I got a terrible case of poison oak digging ditches down on the point for one of the first houses that went down there. I remember going down to hitting Robinson Jeffers up for a job working on his house. He was doing all this masonry, and he was very gentle and nice, but he refused me and said no, he preferred to work alone. And I think that's when his while working on those walls in the tower and all that heavy stonework, that was the gestation period for his writing. I met him first walking on the beach, just scrounging for stones or driftwood or whatever the sea brought in, or just enjoying the walk. And I had a little acquaintance with him for some time before I was aware of him as a poet. That was just when he was coming into his first renown, and he took the literary world by storm at that time, as you probably know. But there is, and there has been for a long time now, a great surge of underground interest in Robinson Jeffers, and he's probably read more now than he ever was.
Are you familiar with a poem that he wrote called The Stonecutters?
Yes.
Do you remember any of it?
Yeah, I can remember that little poem. It was always one of my favorites. I'll try it though. Let's see. Stonecutters fighting time with marble. You four defeated challengers of oblivion eat cynical earnings. Knowing rock splits, records fall down, and the square-limbed Roman letters wear in the rain, scale in the thaws. And the poet as well builds his monument mockingly, for the blithe earth shall die, and the brave sun die blind, his heart blackening. Yet stones have stood for 1,000 years, and pained thoughts found the honey peace in old poems. Steinbeck John and Carl had moved to Los Gatos at one period. He felt the need to get away from too many friends and too much time being taken up with drinking wine and so on, living the Pisano life. And so they went to Los Gatos, and I had occasion during that period to go to San Francisco. And on the way back, I stopped to see John. And I got in late in the day, and we had dinner and talked and visited, and along in the early evening or middle evening, I went to bed, and Carol also went to bed, and John said he was going to stay up and work a little while. And I was sound asleep, and I guess it was several hours later, I heard this voice cry out, "I've got it! I've got it!" And I jumped up, and Carol came out, and we came out into the room, and Steinbeck said, "I've got it." And he read that last part of The Grapes of Wrath, where the young woman gives her breast to the old man. And that was the finale, the finish of that book. And I was right there and with it. I'll never forget that. Chrysalis originally was 11 inches long, was a small bronze that I had done, and I had a show at the Ankrum Gallery in Los Angeles, and Mrs. Ankrum sent out notices of the show to all of her people on her mailing list, and one of them was a man who lived in Denver, Colorado. And so Mrs. Ankrum got us together on the telephone, and he wanted to know if we could make this sculpture 9 or 10 feet long. I made the model out of styrofoam, and then we cut that up and made molds over the separate pieces, and then welded the whole thing back together after it was cast in bronze, and took it east and installed it. That was another wonderful project. They were having a problem. They wanted to make these 2 large fountain pools out of great slabs of granite, 20 feet square. They couldn't find a quarry any place that had stone of that dimension without flaws in it and so on. And I knew where it could be had, and so he commissioned me to take over the project, which I did, and we made these 2 big fountain pools, 20 feet square and 2 feet thick, in Minnesota, and they were taken to Washington on the railroad, and they were put in well cars whose bottoms were just a few inches above the rails, and the stones were stood up on edge and tied in by welded 10-inch I-beams to hold them in place. And they had to route them on 6 different railroads to avoid tunnels and overpasses, and the train was instructed to go no more than 25 miles an hour and only to run in the daytime. We got into Washington, and then we had a crane come down and unloaded the stones on the big low boy trucks in the middle of the night, and we had a huge police escort, police cars and motorcycles, red lights flashing and all that. Went up from the freight yards to the site, and then the next day we installed them, and then they had wanted some of the work to be done on the pools after they were installed in Washington. So another one of my sculptor friends, Jim Hunault, was my helper, and we worked on the finishing of the bowls of the pools there in Washington. And so we worked for several weeks there, and I remember the first snow came on the day we finished, and that snow was just blowing in horizontally on us, and as we finished up our job. and then we headed west again. Yggdrasil, in Scandinavian mythology, is the tree that holds up the world. I was living in Darwin, a little town in the desert at that time, and not far from Death Valley, and my studio was there. So we went up into the hills and quarried the stone, and then we built the tree out of Corten steel. Dan Whetstone, a sculptor friend of mine, we spent hours discussing how we were going to install this sculpture, and we finally ended up realizing the only practical way to do it was by helicopter, which we did. We drilled holes 2 feet into the rock and put steel pins in, and then we welded the base to the steel tree to those pins, and then the stone just sits. It was a marvelous sight, several hundred feet above the sea, and just right above the sea was right below it. And I don't remember how long it's been, but it's been 10 years or something, and the sculpture looks better than ever, you know. The Corten steel performed in just the way it's supposed to. It rusted the first year, and there's no rust stains on the rock. It's just, and the color of the steel is just beautiful, and the stone just up there in the air just looks so pure and white. I've been very fortunate. So many of the people that I've done work for have been such fine people, and we've become friends, and so sort of through my work, there's just been a great enrichment of my life.